The drink hit me before the laughter did, cold and sticky and sweeter than anything I could afford, running down the collar of my patched blazer while the cafeteria went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when it wants you to know it saw. Oops, Camille Delacroix didn't even bother lowering her cup all the way. I thought scentless girls couldn't feel temperature. I felt it. I felt everything. That was the problem nobody at Thornfield Academy understood about me, and the reason I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing on my face while feeling it all underneath. I was not scentless. I was suppressed so hard, so constantly, that the difference had stopped mattering to anyone but me. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 17, a scholarship senior in a school built for children whose parents owned the docks their fathers' fathers had built, and I had exactly 2 things that were mine: a chemistry mind nobody had bothered to notice, and a small glass vial on a cord around my neck that I touched now, under the table, the way other girls touched crosses. The vial had been my father's. He'd been a perfumer before he died, and the last thing he ever taught me was that the nose doesn't lie, even when everything else does. I did not cry in front of Camille Delacroix. I counted the ceiling tiles instead, 41 of them, and I thought about the fact that in 6 months I would graduate and never see her sneer again. And that thought was the only warm thing in the room. Sabine Voss did not laugh with the others. She never did. That was the whole of what anyone at Thornfield knew about her, that she sat at the head table with her spine like a drawn bowstring and her face like weather nobody could read, and that in 3 years no one had ever seen her want anything. They called her the compass because she never wavered, and they called her, behind cupped hands and half in awe, the straightest alpha in the school's 100-year history, untouched by courtship, unmoved by scent, unbending in a hallway where every other alpha postured and preened. Her family owned half the harbor. Her mother ran the other half like a fist. Sabine Voss had never once, in living school memory, looked at anyone the way alphas were supposed to look at someone. She looked at me now. Not because of the drink. Because 2 tables away, in chemistry, someone's dropped burner had cracked a beaker of raw stabilizing compound across my sleeve, and under the sugar and the humiliation, for 1 unguarded second, my suppression cracked with it. I felt it happen before I understood it, heat behind my sternum, my own scent breaking its leash and rolling out into a room that had never once smelled me honestly. Warm sugar and crushed chamomile, my father used to call it, the only 2 notes he ever let me keep of myself. I clamped down on it so fast my vision swam. But Sabine Voss's head had already turned. Her nostrils flared once, involuntary, a small crack in 10 years of granite, and for the length of one held breath, the entire cafeteria watched the straightest alpha at Thornfield forget how to be straight at all. Then the bell rang, and she looked away, and I told myself I had imagined it. I had not imagined it. That became clear the following afternoon in the chemistry wing, when the same cracked beaker of stabilizing compound that had betrayed me in the cafeteria finished the job properly. I was alone, running an independent project Mrs. Vane had helped me design, an alternative to commercial suppressants, gentler, cheaper. Something a girl like me might have actually been able to afford at 14, and the seal on the base solution failed at the worst possible angle, straight up my arm and across my throat. Raw scent doesn't ease out slowly once suppressant fails at that concentration. It floods. Within a minute, the whole east hallway smelled like a summer kitchen, warm sugar and chamomile pouring out of a girl who had spent 3 years making sure no one ever caught more than a hint of her. And within 2 minutes, half the alpha students on that floor had abandoned their classrooms to find the source, Some out of instinct they couldn't control, most just to gawk. I was on the floor of the supply closet, shaking, trying to remember which counter reagent neutralized which base, when the door opened and Sabine Voss filled it. "Move," she said to the boy behind her, not raising her voice, and he moved. She didn't touch me. That was the first thing I understood about her, before I understood anything else. She stood between me and 6 other alphas drawn half out of their minds by a smell they weren't supposed to want, and she did not touch me. She simply became a wall nobody in that hallway was willing to walk through. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Sodium thiosulfate." Second shelf. The brown bottle. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. 1 part to 4, slow, not fast. "It'll show me." I showed her. My hands were useless, so I talked her through it instead. Dosage and ratio and timing. And Sabine Voss, who had never in 3 years done a single thing that wasn't perfectly controlled, knelt on a supply closet floor and measured out a neutralizing compound with a chemistry student's precision she had no business having. Because it turned out the Compass had spent a summer working her family's cargo labs and knew her way around a beaker better than half the seniors in advanced sciences. The scent settled. My scent settled. And in the sudden quiet of it, close enough that I could finally register her the way she'd registered me, vetiver, and something under it like flint struck once and gone cold. She looked at me with an expression I had never once seen her wear in public. "Voss," she said. "Sabine Voss. I know who you are. Everyone knows who I am." Something moved behind the flint. Nobody's ever asked what I smell like before. I hadn't asked. I hadn't needed to. It had already found me. By the following Monday, the story owned the school, not the drink, not the humiliation, but the closet and the compound, and the fact that Sabine Voss had personally petitioned the department head to transfer Wren Calloway into Advanced Scent Sciences, her own program, effective immediately. Nobody quite believed the official reason. I barely believed it myself, standing in the doorway of a lab that smelled like money and citrus polish, watching 30 rich children rearrange their faces around the fact that I now belonged there. "You didn't have to do that," I told her, later in the private study room off the east wing that apparently came with being a Voss. "I know." She didn't look up from the ledger she was annotating. Even her homework looked like an empire being managed. "I wanted to." "Why?" "Because you knew the ratio before I did." A pause. "And because I have spent 3 years making sure no one in this building ever smells anything on me worth noticing, and you made that very difficult in under a minute, without trying." I didn't have an answer for that. She didn't seem to want one. That was, I would learn, the shape of Sabine Voss's affection. She gave things and didn't wait around for gratitude, as though needing thanks would have made the gift about her instead of about you. The wing she lived in during the school week was nothing like the dorms. Floors that swallowed sound, a kitchen no student should have had access to, staff who called her Miss Voss and me nothing at all, uncertain what I was supposed to be called. The gap between her floor and mine wasn't a metaphor. It was marble under my worn shoes, and I felt every seam of it. She noticed things. That was the second thing I learned. She noticed that I skipped lunch twice that week and had a bowl of the good soup sent to the lab under my station without comment. She noticed I kept touching the vial at my throat and never once asked what it was, only watched my hand find it the way a person watches a habit they intend to understand eventually. She noticed the exact moment my patched sleeve caught on a lab stool and tore a little further and said nothing, and the next morning a new blazer, unlabeled, my size exactly, was folded on my dorm bed. "I didn't ask for that," I said. when I found her in the courtyard. I know. She was cleaning a fencing blade, not looking up, the flat economy of her hands more honest than her face ever was. You never ask for anything. It's the least useful thing about you. Is that an insult? It's an observation. Now she looked up. Vetiver and flint, and under the flint, faint. Something warmer she hadn't learned to hide from me yet. Ask me something, right now. Anything. My mouth went dry. Why do they call you the compass? Something closed in her face, quick as a door. Because I don't bend for scent, she said. I never have. She said it like a fact laid on a table between us, final, and I understood, even before I understood why it mattered, that she had just told me a rule she was already breaking. Camille Delacroix found me 3 days later in the East Wing corridor, alone, smiling the way people smile right before they take something from you. You should know, she said, that Sabine and I are contracted since we were 9. Her mother and my father signed it over champagne like it was nothing, and everyone in this school has known it for years. Everyone except, apparently, the charity case she's currently amusing herself with. Contracted, I repeated, the words sitting wrong in my mouth. Bonded, eventually, merged, certainly, the harbor and the shipping lanes, tied up neat with a ribbon. Her smile didn't move. Ask her yourself if you don't believe me. Ask her about the signing ceremony at the Founders Gala. 6 weeks from now. Ask her mother. If you're feeling brave, Odette Voss doesn't raise daughters, she raises assets, and I happen to be the acquisition she's already approved. I asked. That night, in the study room, with the ledger open between us and her pen gone still. It's true, Sabine said, and did not soften it, because she never softened anything, and somehow that honesty hurt worse than a lie would have. My mother arranged it when I was 9. I have never once told her no. Do you want it? A long silence. Vetiver, souring at the edges. I could read it now, the way fear or shame thinned an alpha's scent into something almost sharp. I have never once asked myself that question until you walked into a supply closet smelling like something worth wanting. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw the compass genuinely lost. I don't know what to do with wanting something my mother didn't choose for me. I went back to my dorm that night and didn't sleep. And somewhere in the dark, the school's aging heating system failed all at once, and the storm that had been threatening the coast for 2 days finally arrived to make the darkest hour of my life considerably more literal. The lockdown alarm woke the whole East Wing at 2:30. A burst pipe, a blown transformer, half the dormitory plunged into black water and colder air than any suppressant was built to survive. My compound failed within the hour. I felt it go the way you feel a held breath finally give out, and by the time Sabine found me in the flooded stairwell, soaked and shaking and radiating scent into a hallway with nowhere to run it, I understood with sick clarity that I was in full, unsuppressed, undisguised heat for the first time in 3 years, in front of the one alpha in the building capable of finishing what her family's doctrine had forbidden her to start. Don't touch me, I said, because I loved her enough by then to say it before she had to ask. She didn't. She stood 2 feet back in a stairwell going dark around us, breathing through her mouth, every line of her body fighting an instinct 3 years of iron discipline had never once been tested against, and she said, "Tell me to stop, and I will." Even though she hadn't started anything yet, because that was the whole architecture of her, offering the door before she ever touched the handle. "I'm not telling you to stop." My voice broke on it. "I don't know what I'm telling you." "Then tell me nothing. I'll wait." And she did. She got me to the one dry room on that floor, wrapped me in her own coat instead of her hands, sat 3 feet away with her back against the door like a woman guarding a vault, and waited out 4 hours of a storm and a heat cycle with her jaw locked and her hands fisted on her knees, never once crossing the space between us until I crossed it first. Until I said the words with my own mouth, clear enough that neither of us could pretend later I hadn't meant them. "Ask me," I whispered. "With your words. Ask me if I want this. Do you want this?" Barely a question, everything riding on it anyway. Yes, the kiss that followed wasn't heat madness. It was restraint finally let down like a drawbridge, careful even then, her hand cupping my jaw like something she was afraid of breaking, and when she pulled back to look at me, her flint and vetiver had gone warm all the way through, no sourness left in it anywhere. "I don't bend for scent," she said against my mouth, an echo of the rule she'd handed me weeks before, and then, low, wrecked, honest in a way the compass had never once been in public. I lied. "I bent the day you walked into that closet. I just didn't have the courage to say it. We didn't finish what the storm started. Not that night." But something in the architecture of her had changed permanently, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so out loud, because some truths you only speak once you're sure the roof will hold. She told me about her father 2 nights later, in the greenhouse her mother never visited, orchids she'd been quietly keeping alive since she was 12 arranged around us like witnesses. He died when she was 12, heart, sudden, the kind of death that leaves no time for last words, and her mother had rebuilt herself out of the wreckage into someone who ran a shipping empire on schedules and contracts, because feelings, Odette Voss had told her 9-year-old daughter at the funeral, get people killed slower than storms do. "She's not cruel," Sabine said. "She's terrified. There's a difference, even if it doesn't look like one from where you're standing." I told her about my mother, in turn, the day I presented at 14, Omega where her family had quietly hoped for anything else, the exact sentence my mother used, unfinished, before she packed a bag and left my father to raise what remained of me alone. I told her about the vial, my father's last gift, the compound he'd built for me so I'd never again have to feel what my mother's face had looked like that day. "You've never made a scent for yourself," Sabine said, turning the vial over gently in her palm, careful with it the way she was careful with everything that mattered. "Only ways to hide the one you have. I never had a reason to want to be found." She didn't answer that with words. She answered it by pulling me into her lap among the orchids and holding on, both of us quiet, her heartbeat under my ear steady as a held-together thing, and for one unguarded hour neither of us belonged to anyone's ledger but our own. The gala invitation arrived on Voss family letterhead 3 days later, and my name was not on it, which told me everything about how quickly the outside world was preparing to close back over what we'd built. Camille moved first, and moved cleverly. 2 mornings before the Founders Gala, the department head summoned me to an office already occupied by a school board attorney and a folder of test results claiming my independent stabilizing compound was, in fact, an unlicensed suppressant derivative, banned, dangerous, grounds for expulsion, and a formal report to the designation registry that would follow me for the rest of my life. My handwriting was on the falsified lab log. My signature, forged with a precision that made my stomach drop, was on a formulation sheet I had never written. "We take these matters seriously," the attorney said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. I looked for Sabine in the hallway afterward and found her already summoned to her mother's office instead, the door shut, my name audible even through it, Odette Voss's voice, flat and final, informing her daughter that a scholarship Omega, with a falsified drug charge attached to her name, was not a liability the Voss household could survive attaching itself to. not 6 weeks before a merger signing, and that whatever this had been, it ended today. Sabine came out of that office with her face locked back into the compass, every warm thing I'd watched her become in 6 weeks sealed behind glass again, and when she looked at me in the hallway, it was with the specific, devastating blankness of a girl choosing, in real time, to survive her mother rather than fight for me. "I have to sign the contract Saturday," she said. Flat, final, her mother's cadence exactly. "You should pack." I packed. I sat on my dormitory bed with a suitcase half full and my father's vial in my fist, and I let myself, for 1 full hour, believe that I had already lost everything I'd only just been handed. Then I stopped, because self-pity had never once fixed a formula, and because the falsified lab log had one flaw a room full of lawyers hadn't caught and I had. The compound ratio listed on the forged sheet was chemically impossible. A base to catalyst measure no working chemist would ever write, only someone who'd copied my handwriting without understanding a single word beneath it. I spent that night in the lab instead of packing, running the forged formulation against my own archived notes, cross-referencing purchase logs from the supply closet against the one name that had checked out reagents on the exact dates the fabricated experiments were dated, not mine. Camille Delacroix signed under a fake student ID she'd clearly assumed no one would ever bother auditing, because no one at Thornfield had ever thought to question a Delacroix. By morning, I had a folder of my own, thin but airtight, the kind of evidence a savant with a good nose and 3 years of careful record-keeping builds without meaning to build a weapon, and I walked it straight into the one place I knew both Voss women would be forced to sit still long enough to hear it. The Founders' Gala. 6 hours before a merger contract was scheduled to be signed in front of every family who mattered on the coast. I wore the blazer Sabine had given me because it was the only thing I owned that wasn't patched, and I walked into a ballroom full of people who had spent 3 years pretending not to see me. And for once in my life, I did not make myself small. Odette Voss found me before I found her, standing at the edge of the room like a woman assessing a threat she hadn't budgeted for. "You were told to pack." I did. I held up the folder. I also finished my homework. I laid it out for her in the middle of the gala floor, quiet enough not to draw a crowd yet, precise enough that a woman who had run a shipping empire on numbers for 2 decades couldn't dismiss a single line of it. The impossible ratios, the forged supply logs, the reagent purchases traced to a name that wasn't mine. Odette Voss read it standing perfectly still, and something in her face I hadn't expected to see there moved, slow and grudging, like ice deciding to consider the idea of a thaw. "This is thorough," she said. I had a good teacher. He said the nose doesn't lie. I made myself hold her eyes. Neither do numbers, if you know how to read them. Across the ballroom, Sabine had found us, still locked into the compass, still wearing her mother's decision like armor, and it was Camille who broke first, arriving at exactly the wrong moment, smiling that same smile, congratulating Odette on a signing that hadn't happened yet, and in doing so mentioning, carelessly, a detail about the falsified test results that had never been made public. Odette Voss turned to her with the specific stillness of a woman who has just heard a confession disguised as small talk. "How," she said, very quietly, "would you know that detail, Camille, unless you wrote it yourself?" The room hadn't caught it yet. Sabine had. She crossed the floor to stand beside me, close enough that our scents finally, publicly, unmistakably overlapped in front of 200 witnesses, and when Camille's smile finally faltered, it was because she understood, one beat too late, that she had just handed her own noose to the one family in the room with the resources to hang her with it properly. Odette Voss did not raise her voice. She never seemed to need to. She simply lifted the folder in one hand, addressed the room in the tone she used for board announcements, and informed 200 of the coast's most powerful families that the Delacroix name had, this evening, forfeited any claim to Voss Trust with fabricated evidence against a minor and an attempted framing that bordered on criminal fraud. That security would be escorting Miss Delacroix from the premises, that the registry complaint would now travel in the opposite direction, and that the merger contract scheduled for signing that night was, effective immediately, dissolved. Camille's face went the color of old paper. Her father's hand found her elbow, hard, already calculating how much of the evening's ruin was recoverable, and the answer, from the speed of the withdrawal that followed, appeared to be none of it. 2 security staff walked her out through a ballroom full of people who had spent 3 years watching her humiliate everyone beneath her, and not one of them looked away out of kindness. Sabine's hand found mine in the wreckage of it, in front of everyone, and did not let go. "I told my mother no," she said low, "only for me. This morning, before you ever walked in with that folder, I told her I would not sign, framed or not, guilty or not, because I had already chosen, and she raised me smarter than to think a harbor was worth more than that." "Then why did you tell me to pack?" "Because I am my mother's daughter, and I am learning, badly, how to be brave out loud instead of just in private." Her thumb moved once over my knuckles. "I am asking you, with my words, in front of every person who has ever made you feel unfinished, will you stay?" Odette Voss, still holding the folder, looked at her daughter, then at me, then, longest of all, at the space between us where our scents had settled into something the whole room could smell was permanent. "I raised you to survive storms," she said finally to Sabine, in a voice with something new cracking through the varnish. "I did not raise you to marry one and call it strategy. Perhaps I was wrong about which kind of match keeps a family standing." She turned, almost gently, to me. "Miss Calloway, I owe you an apology and, apparently, a fragrance license. Your formulation is better than half the ones my own chemists have patented." The applause that followed wasn't for the contract. It was for the moment Sabine Voss, the straightest alpha Thornfield had produced in 100 years, bent her head to my throat in front of 200 witnesses, breathed in warm sugar and crushed chamomile without an ounce of shame left in her, and asked, one last time, with her words, whether I would let her make the mark permanent. "Ask me properly," I said, laughing through it, unfinished no longer. "Wren Calloway," her voice didn't shake, "will you let me claim you?" Yes, the bite was gentle and certain, and the bond that opened between us afterward felt less like being taken and more like a door finally unlocking from both sides at once. 6 months later, the greenhouse orchids had company, marigolds, an entire bed of them, planted the week after Sabine asked Perpetua Vane what flower my mother used to grow before everything fell apart, and I came home from my first semester at the Coastal Chemistry Institute Odette Voss had personally funded a scholarship for, my scholarship, no strings. To find both of them elbow-deep in soil and arguing cheerfully about drainage. Camille Delacroix's registry complaint against me had been quietly reversed and replaced with one of her own, and the last I heard, her family's shipping contracts had shrunk to a fraction of what they'd been, her name no longer welcome at any gala on the coast that mattered. Joe, the second bully who'd laughed loudest at the cafeteria table, had been quietly asked to leave Thornfield after the board's audit turned up 2 more falsified records with her signature attached. Nobody at that school threw a drink at anyone again, not that year, not that anyone told me about. August Reyes, Sabine's oldest friend, who had spent our first month circling me with the suspicion of a bodyguard who'd never once seen his captain wait for anyone, showed up at the bonding ceremony with a gift he'd clearly built himself. A wooden case, lined, sized exactly for one small glass vial, and said gruffly, in front of everyone, that in 15 years of fencing beside Sabine Voss, he had never once seen her run toward something instead of standing still and daring it to come to her, and that whatever I'd done to change that, he approved of, formally, on the record. Sabine proposed properly on a cliff above the harbor the week after graduation, on one knee in the wind, with a small box that held not a ring first, but a bottle, a scent she'd spent 3 months building with Perpetua's help, my father's warm sugar, and crushed chamomile layered now under something new, something hers, vetiver settling into it like a hand finding a hand. "You never made one for yourself," she said. "So I made the first one for you instead. Consider it a start." We married in autumn, small, marigolds on every table, my father's rules spoken instead of written into the vows we wrote ourselves. Find the true note, then build the rest around it, and Odette Voss stood as witness, with a steadiness in her voice that told everyone in that room exactly how far she'd traveled since a ballroom folder had first cracked her open. I stood at the cliff's edge the next morning with Sabine's arms around me, salt wind lifting both our scents into something the whole coast could have tasted, the vial that had once hidden me now sitting empty and forgiven on a shelf back home, replaced by a bottle with both our names pressed into the glass. I had spent 3 years believing invisibility was the safest thing I could offer the world. I had been wrong. The safest thing, it turned out, was being found, completely, deliberately, on purpose, by someone who never once looked away again. The end.